The Trainee File, Part 1, The Setup. Special Agent Trainee Dana Whitfield had been in the field division for 11 days when Officer Roy Cutler decided she was exactly the kind of person his precinct existed to catch. It wasn't anything she'd done. It was, as it almost always was with men like Cutler, a matter of arithmetic performed entirely in his own head. A black woman, alone, sitting in a parked sedan outside a strip mall on the edge of his patrol zone for longer than he thought was reasonable, wearing a blazer that looked, to his eye, more expensive than it should have. He didn't know, because he had never once bothered to consider that he might not know everything relevant to the situation in front of him, that she was sitting there because she was conducting cold surveillance as part of a training rotation, watching a pawn shop 3 doors down that had been flagged for suspected stolen goods trafficking, an assignment she'd been given specifically because it required patience and a low profile. Cutler pulled his cruiser in behind her, blocking her exit, and approached with the rolling, unhurried gait of a man who had never once had this kind of approach questioned. "Ma'am, you mind telling me what you're doing parked here for the last 40 minutes? "I don't, actually," Dana said, calm, her eyes flicking once to her mirror before returning to him. "But I'm going to ask you to step back from the window. This is a public street. I can stand wherever I want. You're standing close enough that I can't open my door if I need to. Step back, please." It was the wrong answer in Cutler's private ledger. Not wrong because it was unreasonable, but wrong because it was calm and confident, and offered without the deference he'd come to expect from people he pulled over in this particular stretch of road. He'd built his entire career on the assumption that confidence from certain people was itself a kind of evidence. And Dana Whitfield, 26 years old and 11 days into the most important assignment of her young career, had just handed him what he believed was exactly that. "License and registration." She handed over her driver's license without comment, folded neatly, no argument. The practiced economy of motion of someone trained not to give an aggressive officer anything extra to react to. What she did not hand over, because he did not ask for it, and because revealing it prematurely would have collapsed 11 days of careful positioning, was the federal credential sitting in the console beside her, the one identifying her as a trainee agent embedded in a joint task force with this exact department, on assignment specifically because of a patent file that had Roy Cutler's name at the very top of it. He ran her plate. Clean. He ran her name. Clean. There was, by any legitimate measure, absolutely nothing here. No expired registration, no warrant, no violation of any kind. Nothing except a woman doing nothing wrong in a car she was legally entitled to park. That should have been the end of it. For most officers, it would have been. "Step out of the vehicle." "On what grounds?" "I said step out." She considered, for a fraction of a second, whether this was the moment to end the charade, whether producing her credential now would save her the indignity of whatever was about to happen. But 11 days of careful, deliberate positioning had taught her something her supervising agent had repeated to her more than once during the briefing that put her on this assignment. The file only becomes bulletproof if he does this without knowing who's watching. The moment he suspects, he'll clean up his behavior for the cameras and go right back to it the second the cameras are gone. She stepped out. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle." "Officer, I haven't been told what I'm being detained for." "You're being detained because I said so, and because that mouth of yours is about 2 more sentences from a disorderly conduct charge, on top of whatever we find in this car." Whatever we find. The phrase landed with a particular, familiar weight, the sound of a man who had already decided the outcome of a search he hadn't yet conducted, the sound of a man who considered evidence a formality to be produced after the verdict, not a thing to be discovered before it. He searched the car with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with performance. For whom, Dana couldn't yet say, since the strip mall's sparse foot traffic offered him no obvious audience. Though there was, in fact, an audience he didn't know about. A compact recording device clipped inside her jacket's interior seam, capturing audio with a clarity that would later render every word of this stop unambiguous. And a second, wider-angle camera built into the rear-view mirror housing of her own vehicle, a standard modification for undercover surveillance units that most patrol officers had no idea existed. He found the bag under the passenger seat 11 minutes into the search, a small quantity of a white crystalline substance in a plastic baggie, the kind of discovery that, in Cutler's experience, had never once failed to end a stop exactly the way he wanted it to end. "Well, well," he said, holding it up. "You want to explain this?" "I've never seen that bag in my life," Dana said, and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not panic, not the rising fear he expected and, on some level, wanted to see, but a flat, contained fury that she was working very hard to keep contained, because losing that control now would hand him exactly the narrative he was already building. "That's what they all say." "Officer Cutler." She said his name deliberately, reading it off his badge with the precision of someone committing it permanently to memory, though she had, in fact, already had it memorized for 11 days. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider what you're about to do." He laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "Reconsider what? I got a bag of what looks like meth found in your car during a legal search. You're not in a position to be giving me opportunities, sweetheart." "Cuff her," he said to his partner, a younger officer named T.J. Ruiz, who had been standing several feet back through the entire search, his discomfort visible in the stiff set of his shoulders, in the way his eyes kept moving between Cutler's hands and Dana's face, like he was watching two different versions of a story unfold and couldn't decide which one he was supposed to believe. Ruiz hesitated. "I said cuff her." He did it. His hands were not steady when he closed the metal around her wrists, and Dana felt him fumble slightly with the ratchet, and understood in that moment that whatever was happening to her right now was not something the younger officer was comfortable with, even if his discomfort wasn't yet strong enough to overcome 6 months of learning to defer to his training officer's judgment above his own. "You have the right to remain silent," Cutler began, reciting the words with the bored, mechanical cadence of a man who had said them 1,000 times and had long since stopped hearing what they meant. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." "I know my rights, officer," Dana said, and something in the particular way she said it, not defiant, not frightened, but almost clinical, like a woman reviewing a script she already knew the ending to, made Ruiz's stomach tighten in a way he still wouldn't be able to name for several more hours. Part 2. The Wrong File. The processing at the precinct went the way Cutler expected it to go, right up until the moment it very much did not. He'd written the incident report before they'd even finished booking her, a habit he'd developed over the years, drafting the narrative first and letting the details of the actual arrest arrange themselves around it, rather than the other way around. Subject was observed loitering in a high-crime area for an extended period. Subject became argumentative and uncooperative during a routine welfare check. A search of the vehicle, conducted with subject's implied consent, revealed a controlled substance consistent with methamphetamine. None of that had happened, precisely, but Cutler had never needed his reports to be precise. He'd needed them to be sufficient. And in 6 years on this force, sufficient had never once failed him. What he did not know, what nobody in the booking area knew, because Dana Whitfield had spent 11 days deliberately ensuring nobody would know, was that her federal credential, the moment her personal effects were logged and inventoried at intake, would trigger an automatic flag in a system Cutler had never had reason to think about, a system that existed specifically for moments exactly like this one. The accidental, catastrophic collision of local law enforcement misconduct with an active federal undercover operation. The flag reached her supervising agent's phone within 4 minutes of the intake officer scanning her credential into the property log. Special Agent in Charge, Dennis Okafor, had been running the Joint Task Force investigation into this precinct for the better part of 5 months, built around a file that had grown, incident by incident, complaint by complaint, into one of the more damning patterns his division had reviewed in years. Nearly all of it centered on a single name that kept surfacing again and again in complaints that the department's own internal review process had somehow, repeatedly, found insufficient grounds to act on. Roy Cutler's name. They placed Dana on rotation through this precise division, specifically to see whether the pattern would replicate itself in real time, under controlled observation, with an agent trained to document everything without provoking anything. It was a calculated risk, the kind of operation that carried real danger for the agent embedded inside it. Danger that Okafor had weighed carefully before approving the assignment. Danger that had, in the space of one afternoon, become considerably more real than any of them had planned for. He was in his car within 90 seconds of the alert, 3 additional agents following in a second vehicle, moving toward the precinct with the particular, focused urgency of people who understood that the difference between a successful operation and a serious problem could come down to a matter of minutes. Dana sat in a holding cell for the better part of an hour, her wrists released from the cuffs, but her personal effects, including, crucially, her actual credential, still sitting in a manila envelope at the property desk, waiting for someone with the authority to open it. She did not panic. She had trained, extensively, for the possibility of exactly this kind of complication, though the training had always felt, until this afternoon, like a theoretical exercise rather than something she'd actually have to live through. She sat with her back straight, her breathing even, and reviewed methodically every detail of the stop, the timeline, the search, the precise wording Cutler had used, cataloguing it all the way she'd been trained to, because she understood, even sitting in a cold cell with a false charge hanging over her, that everything happening to her right now was, in its own perverse way, exactly the evidence the operation had been built to capture. Officer Ruiz came by twice during that hour, ostensibly to check on her, and both times he lingered a moment longer than procedure required, his discomfort deepening each time. "That bag," he said quietly on his second visit, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke. "I didn't see him find it under the seat like he said." "What did you see?" "I saw him reach under there. I saw his hand come back with it. I don't—" He stopped himself, visibly wrestling with 6 years of institutional deference to a training officer against something more fundamental that had apparently only just started asserting itself. "I don't know what I saw, exactly. But it didn't look right." "Write that down," Dana said. "Whatever you saw, write it down now, while it's fresh, before anyone has a chance to tell you what you're supposed to have seen instead." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested that this was, in fact, the first time in his short career that anyone had suggested his own observations might matter more than his training officer's version of events. He didn't get the chance to write anything down before the front doors of the precinct opened and 4 federal agents walked in. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Pulowski, who had been running the front counter for 14 years, looked up to find a compact man in an unremarkable grey suit sliding a credential across the counter, with the flat, unhurried authority of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. "Special Agent in Charge, Dennis Okafor, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need to speak with whoever processed the intake of a woman brought in within the last hour, under the name Dana Whitfield, and I need it immediately." "Sir, if this is about a case, you'll want to go through—" "This isn't about a case. This is about one of my trainees, currently sitting in one of your holding cells, arrested on a fabricated narcotics charge by an officer of this department who does not know, and did not know at the time, that he was detaining a federal agent actively assigned to investigate his conduct." The words landed across the booking area with the force of a physical object. Pulowski's face went through several rapid transformations: confusion, disbelief, and finally something closer to dread. The particular dread of a man who has just understood that the ordinary Tuesday he thought he was having has, in fact, become something that will follow this department for years. "I need her released, unharmed, with all of her personal effects returned to her. And I need it in the next 5 minutes," Okafor continued. And I need Officer Cutler's incident report, exactly as filed, before anyone has the chance to revise it. Roy Cutler, who had been leaning against a filing cabinet 20 feet away, filling out the last of his paperwork with the loose, satisfied posture of a man who considered his afternoon's work already finished, heard his own name and turned, and felt something cold settle into his stomach the moment he registered the word federal and connected it, with a slowness that would haunt him for the rest of his life, to the woman he'd left sitting in a cell an hour earlier. Part 3. The Pattern File. They released her within 4 minutes. Dana walked out of the holding cell, not with the shaken, relieved posture of someone who had just narrowly escaped a wrongful conviction, but with the composed, deliberate calm of someone stepping into the next phase of a plan she had understood, from the very beginning, might require exactly this kind of detour. Agent Okafor met her at the edge of the booking area, and the brief, unspoken exchange between them, a single nod, nothing more, carried the particular economy of two professionals confirming, without needing words, that the operation had just produced precisely the evidence it had been designed to surface. "You're all right?" he asked, once they'd stepped into the relative privacy of an empty interview room. "I'm fine. I want it on record that at no point did I break protocol. I didn't identify myself. I didn't do anything to provoke escalation beyond declining to answer questions I wasn't legally required to answer." "I know. I've got Ruiz's preliminary statement already. The second unit picked it up from him on the way in. He wrote down what he saw before anyone had a chance to coach him otherwise. It corroborates everything on your recording." "There's a recording?" "There's two. The one in your jacket and the one built into your vehicle's mirror housing. We've got Cutler's hands going under that seat from an angle his own dashcam never would have caught, and we've got every word of the stop, start to finish, completely unedited." Dana exhaled, and for the first time since Cutler's cruiser had pulled in behind her that afternoon, something in her shoulders loosened. "How bad is the file, beyond me?" Okafor's expression tightened. 11 prior complaints in 6 years, every one of them closed by internal review as unsubstantiated. 4 of them involving planted evidence allegations, nearly identical to what happened to you today. 2 officers who'd previously worked alongside him have already come forward in the last 3 hours, once word got around that this department finally had a case nobody could bury. What happened to you this afternoon isn't an aberration, Dana. It's a pattern that's been running in this precinct for years, and you just became the piece of evidence that makes the whole pattern impossible to ignore. Roy Cutler was placed on administrative leave before the end of his shift, escorted from the building by 2 of his own colleagues, with an expression that shifted over the course of that short walk, from indignant confusion to something closer to genuine fear, as the reality of who he'd detained that afternoon began to settle into a shape he could no longer talk his way around. The federal complaint, filed 11 days later, did not treat the incident as an isolated event. It treated it as confirmation, the culmination of a pattern and practice investigation that had spent 5 months quietly assembling exactly the kind of evidence Cutler's afternoon stop had handed them in the space of a single hour. Fabricated probable cause, planted evidence, falsified reporting, and a documented history of near-identical conduct toward black residents of his patrol zone that the department's own Internal Affairs Division had reviewed and dismissed again and again, without ever once connecting the pattern that an outside observer could see within minutes of opening the file. At his federal trial 8 months later, Cutler's attorney attempted the arguments such attorneys typically attempt, that his client had acted on a good faith, if mistaken, assessment of reasonable suspicion, that a career of service deserved weight against a single incident. The recording made short work of both arguments. The jury heard, in Cutler's own voice, the moment he told his partner, "You're not in a position to be giving me opportunities, sweetheart." A sentence that needed no interpretation, no context, no argument about ambiguous intent. They heard, in a separate segment of audio recovered from the vehicle's mirror-mounted camera, the precise sound of a plastic bag being retrieved from Cutler's own duty belt before his hand disappeared under the passenger seat. a detail the defense had not known existed until the moment it played in open court. A detail that transformed the case from disputed testimony into simple, undeniable fact. He was convicted on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. The sentencing judge, reading from a pre-sentence report that documented not just this incident, but the 11-complaint pattern behind it, imposed a term of 7 years, along with a permanent federal bar from any law enforcement employment in the United States. "What troubles this court most," the judge said, before pronouncing sentence, "is not simply what you did to Ms. Whitfield on that afternoon. It's the 11 times before that afternoon when this exact pattern surfaced, and 11 times when someone in a position to stop it chose not to look closely enough to see it. Ms. Whitfield's case did not create this pattern. It simply became the one instance your department could no longer explain away." Dana Whitfield finished her training rotation 4 months after the stop, graduating from trainee status into a full field assignment. The case that had nearly derailed her career becoming, instead, one of the defining credentials of her early record. Not because she had sought the confrontation, but because she had survived it, with the discipline the assignment demanded, documenting everything, reacting to nothing, refusing to let a false arrest become anything other than exactly what it was: evidence. She testified before a congressional subcommittee 18 months later, as part of a broader hearing on pattern and practice investigations and the barriers local review boards routinely erected against federal oversight. "I want to be careful about how this story gets told," she said, near the end of her testimony, her voice carrying the same measured calm it had carried in that holding cell all those months earlier. "It would be easy to tell it as a story about one bad officer who happened to arrest the wrong woman. That's not the story. The story is that 11 complaints from 11 different residents of that precinct described almost exactly what happened to me, and every single one of those complaints was closed without meaningful investigation, because the people who filed them didn't have a federal credential sitting in an envelope at the property desk. I didn't get justice that day because I was extraordinary. I got justice because the system happened to have, for once, a piece of evidence it couldn't dismiss. The other 11 people deserved that same evidence, and they never got it. That's the actual failure here. Not one officer's conduct, but a review process that only works when the person on the other end of it happens to be someone the department can't afford to ignore." The subcommittee's report, published 4 months later, cited her testimony directly in its recommendation that federal oversight be extended to any department with a pattern of dismissed complaints exceeding a defined threshold, a recommendation that would, over the following years, reshape internal review procedures in departments far beyond the one where Roy Cutler had once believed his badge made him untouchable. Dana kept a single item from the case on her desk in the years that followed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the exact weight the work carried. A printed still frame from the mirror camera footage, showing the precise moment Cutler's hand emerged from beneath the passenger seat, the bag already in it, his face caught in an expression of casual, practiced certainty that the story he was about to tell would simply become the truth, the way it always had before. It was, she thought, a useful thing to keep close. Not because it commemorated a victory, but because it recorded, with total clarity, exactly the kind of certainty the work existed to dismantle. One file, one pattern, one recorded moment at a time. The end.